Hi, welcome to Storytelling Animals, a green new podcast of climate, ecology, and animal justice. I'm your host, Dayton Martindale, and today my guest is Johanna Bozuwa, the Executive Director of the Climate and Community Project, which is a climate justice policy organization. So, as you may have heard, last week the Inflation Reduction Act passed Congress, which is simultaneously the largest climate legislation that has ever made it through U.S. Congress, and contains a lot of provisions that are friendly to fossil fuel interests and have made a lot of climate justice organizations upset. So how did we get here? What's actually in the bill? What are the good parts? What are the bad parts? What are the ugly parts? And where do we go next if we want to mitigate the damage of the bad parts and maybe even ask for more? So that's what I talked to Johanna about. Her organization has put forward an analysis of the Inflation Reduction Act, focusing on the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I will link that in the episode description if you want more detail. There's also a lot of good detail in this conversation. I hope you enjoy. I should also note that a couple questions about the Inflation Reduction Act I got from some of you, listeners who support me on Patreon by making a small monthly financial contribution. I invited to submit questions about the Inflation Reduction Act, and so you too can be invited to do parts of my job for me if you support this podcast on Patreon. The lowest level works out to roughly $1 an episode, the next one roughly $2 an episode. You'll also get early access to episodes, at some levels membership in the Storytelling Animals book club, and other perks that hopefully make it worth it to you. Speaking of that book club, we are 1 week away from our group discussion of As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock by Dina Julia Whitaker. It's a short book. If you're able to get it, hopefully you will be able to read it within a week. Even if you aren't able to read it, I'm going to link in the episode description a couple book reviews of it that I thought were super helpful. I'll link to a couple podcasts that she did about the book, interviews she did. So I invite you to join even if you haven't been able to read the book, just because the issues are so important about how, an Indigenous perspective on environmental justice really changes how we view the relevant issues. So if you want to join that book club, the two ways to do that are to subscribe on Patreon, as I mentioned, or to sign up for my free weekly newsletter. You can attend a book club as a trial member. I put a link to that, my newsletter, in the episode description as well. Okay, back to the Inflation Reduction Act. Here's my interview with Johanna. Hi, I'm here with Johanna Bozuwa, the Executive Director of the Climate and Community Project. Johanna, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Dayton, for having me.
Yeah, so maybe before we get started too much on the Inflation Reduction Act, I was wondering if you could just tell listeners, a little bit about who you are, your experience in climate policy, and what the Climate and Community Project is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working on kind of climate and energy issues for a long time now. Originally kind of started off working on anti-fossil fuel work and really then wanted to answer the question, what is the energy system we're building in the next, in this next generation? And that really led me to think a lot about energy justice and how are we going to build the next system, and have worked a lot on utility justice, energy, and what the transition to renewables is going to look like and how we actually center people and the folks who were exploited and extracted in the previous system to ensure that doesn't happen in the next. And I work for the Climate and Community Project. We're a relatively new organization. We're a think tank that is committed to kind of the tenets of the Green New Deal and climate justice. We're a network of academics and researchers coming at this from a kind of an explicit climate left perspective. trying to add detail to the demands of the climate movement. So we've produced projects like the Green New Deal for public schools that Representative Jamal Mobin has built a piece of comprehensive legislation around. We've worked on a range of issues, including even things like climate reparations and what that looks like with Olufemi Taiwo and Patrick Bigger. So a range of different things, but very much committed to building the decade of the Green New Deal.
Mm-hmm. And Olufemi was actually one of the first guests on this podcast about his Reconsider and Reparations books.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
So yeah, he was great. So before we kind of zoom into kind of the nuts and bolts, maybe we could take the zoomed out perspective and just like, I think we're recording this on Monday, August 15th. It passed the Senate maybe about a week ago. The Inflation Reduction Act passed the House, I think Friday. Biden said he's going to sign it. So what are kind of the two or three major big picture takeaways before we get into details?
Yeah. So the major takeaways from my perspective is that the Inflation Reduction Act, as it currently stands, like it is going to be the biggest investment in climate that we've seen coming out of the federal government in the United States. That said, it is, and it's about $369 billion going into climate related and energy related issues. That is going to be a massive investment. But it still pales in comparison to what we really need in order to tackle the climate crisis. This was a bill ultimately built in collaboration between Senator Chuck Schumer and Senator Manchin, which means that there's a lot of good in this bill for investing in renewable energy, but there is also a lot of bad and ugly, including investments actually in that will perpetuate the fossil fuel industry. So it's been a very long journey to actually getting something that would pass and get past Manchin. We should definitely see this as the climate movement increasing its power and being able to, get a major piece of legislation through. But we should be very clear as well that there are still communities that are sacrificed via this bill.
Mm-hmm. So how did we get to this point? Because, listeners might remember discussions like a year or so ago about Build Back Better, and that was going to be in tandem with a bipartisan infrastructure bill, but then those talks collapsed. Everyone thought it was dead, and then kind of here we are, and we have a bill that's not as good, but still something. So what happened over the last year?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing to take it back, maybe even a little bit further to, Sunrise Movement sitting in Nancy Pelosi's office. One thing that really changed in that moment, I think, and what we've seen is this building towards a Green New Deal and this conception that climate action is not austerity. Climate action is investment. And I think that's one thing I'm taking away from this moment in terms of how the political economy is shifting, is that the climate movement has been able to push a message that investing in climate is an investment in our communities. And so the Green New Deal escalated over the past couple of years. And then we had, obviously, COVID hit. There was this need for injection as Biden comes into the White House. Yes, as you mentioned, we had the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and then Build Back Better was really Biden's big, we are investing in our economy, and this will also be in part a climate bill. And When those two were split, it allowed Manchin to basically stop the project in its tracks. And there have been basically over the past year an exhausting process of almost getting a bill, almost getting it past the finish line, and then Manchin and Cinema pulling the plug. And then kind of out of nowhere, a few weeks ago, so after there was a group of congressional staffers actually who realized kind of the scale of the crisis and the fact that nothing was going to get passed, and they actually had a sit-in Schumer's office, and that really brought it to Schumer's attention, and he saw the pressure. And then just I think a couple days after that, we saw Manchin and Schumer say, we've come to an agreement, and we've got the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think that for a lot of people in the climate movement, it's been a really stressful and tenuous year. And I think right now we've got a bill that people are still kind of reeling from, honestly. It was a backdoor bill in a lot of ways that folks have been reacting to and trying to figure out and navigate how they feel about it.
Yeah, so you released, while everyone was reeling from it, the Climate and Community Project released an analysis of the deal that separated into the good, the bad, and the ugly, which I kind of interpret as, the good, I guess, is straightforward. The bad were often kind of omissions and ways in which it didn't go far enough or didn't go very far at all. And the ugly is a few spaces where it's genuinely counterproductive, helpful to fossil fuel interests. So maybe let's start with the good, and just kind of, I think there's a lot of tax credits in this bill.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the good ones, and what are they going to do, or at least the highlights?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So one of the biggest things that this bill does is it extends the tax credits for renewable energy or clean energy. And these are tax credits that have been in place in the past, but they're always in the peril of phase out, just about to be lost. And what this bill does, is it says, hey, clean energy, we are going to keep on providing you and subsidizing you so that we can bring in this new era of renewables. And it does that by providing 10 years of these subsidies at 30%. And a really exciting thing associated with these tax credits are actually that you don't get the full tax credit unless you pay your workers prevailing wages. And I think that's a huge, huge win when it comes to renewable energy and how we're transforming the sector. Because one of the things that's often said, especially by workers countering the renewable energy build out, is like, hey, y'all, like, at least in the fossil fuel industry, we have unions, we've like fought for our contracts, like these are good working jobs, and solar, we're looking at not as great jobs. It doesn't have it's not unionized. And so this is an opportunity to say, like, we are actually making renewable energy jobs good jobs by doing so. So if you do not pay prevailing wages, you'll, I believe, get a 6% subsidy of your project, but it's 30% if you do pay prevailing wages. And another really exciting thing about these tax credits is the fact that there's this thing called direct pay. So to give a little bit of context, in order to in order to get access to subsidies in the form of tax credits, you have to pay a certain amount of taxes, or you have to have what's called a tax appetite. And it turns out if you are either a young company that doesn't, is just coming to be, or you're a nonprofit that doesn't pay taxes, or even if you are a government entity, if you are a publicly owned entity, you don't pay taxes. So you don't have a tax appetite. And what was happening is this just kind of like financialization of the deployment of renewable energy, because all of these young companies or governments would have to go to Wall Street to set up these really complicated deals, basically, that are called tax equity partnerships. So that the Wall Street would be able to take the credit for the tax and use it kind of as like a tax shelter in some regards, and then kind of launder it through so that then the companies would get close to that 30% level, or the government entity. So what having direct pay will do is it means that it's just a direct subsidy to the entity, which means that we're going to be able to see governments, local government, public power, municipal utilities, rural electric co-ops, nonprofits, churches, for instance, even be able to get that subsidy directly and cut out the increasing financialization that was happening with our next energy system. So that's actually a really fantastic thing to see coming down the pipe. And then also on housing, the bill will also expand tax incentives for households, specifically for energy efficiency. I think each household, like if you're an owner of your household, will get up to $7,500. And so that's a really exciting thing that will help us electrify and make our houses more efficient on the good end of the spectrum. And I'll add one last tax incentives that's exciting to a certain degree is that, they're trying, President Biden has made electric vehicles a big part of his proposal. And so this would incentivize more electric vehicles on the road, and also that those electric vehicles are manufactured and sourced from the United States.
And are the consumer-based or the consumer-oriented tax credits, are those direct pay as well?
I believe they will. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they will.
I think that could be an obstacle where if you aren't paying a lot of taxes, i.e. if you aren't rich, then you wouldn't get as much of a subsidy, would seem to be somewhat of a perverse way of doing it.
Yeah. And I will say on that note that to get a little bit into the bad of these types of tax incentives, I think that when it comes to kind of the consumer facing ones, there is a distinction. There is going to be a difference with who has access to these, because it's predicated upon, in the case of the efficiency and electrification, it is still predicated on home ownership. And as we know from in the United States, we have a racial bias of home ownership, and that means that whiter, wealthier households are the ones that are going to have access to those tax incentives. And that was a really big cut from Build Back Better, which was going to be putting $60 billion directly into public housing. And now that will be gone, and it's much, much lower levels. So from our perspective at Climate and Community Project, we see this as a really big lost opportunity, and in terms of this actually helping people who are most affected by inflation, and also on the front lines of climate change in a lot of ways. It's tenants, it's people who are having a hard time paying their bills, and we think that the bill should have definitely gone further and really directly tackled the issue of tenants and efficiency and how to lower their bills on a daily basis as compared to some of the kind of more upper middle class folks who are going to get access to the tax incentives.
Mm-hmm. If any of my listeners do own their homes, what sorts of, when we talk about home efficiency, what types of things will they be able to get tax credits for?
A great example is heat pumps. We absolutely need to be switching over. So a lot of, depending on where you live in the United States, a lot of people are hooked up to natural gas and, get their heating from pipelines that come through. And this is an opportunity by installing heat pumps in your home to actually electrify your entire house. And heat pump installations will also, often make it so that you can have access to both heat and cooling needs, which, in places, I live in Portland, Maine these days, and I'll tell you that a lot of places are not equipped now to handle the higher energy or the higher heat levels that we have. So, having access to heat pumps will be a really big thing. It also includes like weatherization and insulation being shifted as well. So I think there are numerous things that folks will be able to install and receive subsidy for.
Cool. So just because you already touched on it, for the Patreon supporters of this podcast, I asked them what questions they have about the Inflation Reduction Act. And one question I got was, what happened to the e-bike rebates from Build Back Better?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I think basically they're gone. And that's a real shame. One of the things with this bill, it's great. We need to electrify our transportation, but this bill very much focuses on perpetuating the age of the car and a car-centric economy in the United States. And the Climate Community Project member, Johanna Bozuwa, has done a lot of really incredible research and writing on this and was one of the main contributors for our transportation section of our bill review. And what we really need to be building right now is a multimodal transportation system. We need something that is going to allow people to have e-bikes. It's going to allow them to take electrified buses places, that is investing in, even like the bus trolleys or in our subway systems, because that is really a key way when people are hurting at the pump, which we currently are with increasing prices. Being able to take the subway or public transportation is again going to support people who feel inflation the most. And that is where we're seeing this bill fall short, sadly, is that it does not, it basically zeroes out any of the Build Back Better funding for public transportation and limits our ability to kind of build out kind of the multimodal transportation like e-bikes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another, even within cars, I saw that you can get a much bigger tax credit subsidy for an SUV than you can even just for a normal sized car.
Right, exactly. And what we've seen is that, obviously the United States is known for its big cars, but those are actually like incredibly unsafe too. As we keep on building these entities, like the smaller cars, the more efficient cars, like are also going to require less battery materials even, are not being the ones that are incentivized to the same degree. And that is bad from a supply chain perspective and us actually being able to produce those cars, but also from a safety perspective of people on the road too.
So another question from a Patreon supporter is, overall, what was the biggest thing Manchin took away from the final bill? So I guess from Build Back Better to Inflation Reduction Act, what's one of the biggest things that didn't make it through?
That didn't make it through. Yeah. One of the biggest things that was lost was the Clean Energy Payment Program, CEPP, which was in Build Back Better, that basically said, if you keep, it basically incentivized utilities and to electrify the energy system and to put on more clean energy. And then if you didn't achieve those goals, you were then penalized and had to pay the federal government that then was going to be redirected towards like building more renewables. That was cut. And I think that's something that we saw across the board when it came to Build Back Manchin instead of Build Back Better, is that we lost a lot of our sticks. And in particular, we saw clean energy and fossil fuels almost treated on the same plane. This is not, to be very clear, this bill does not wind down the fossil fuel industry. It absolutely does not. In fact, there is many things that are going to perpetuate the fossil fuel industry, and I think that is because of Manchin. A very clear example of this, Dayton, is the quid pro quo that's in there that basically says that you need to hold a lease the year before for offshore fossil fuels in order to even hold a lease for offshore wind. And what we are seeing through that is that the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska are going to feel the brunt of that, and are already, the Gulf and the South have already been seen as a sacrifice zone, and that just locks it in. This is the area where apparently they want to still be building out oil and gas, and this is where all of the big storms are coming through. Hurricane season is becoming all the more intense. And they're saying, no, we're going to keep on building oil and gas infrastructure into the future. And another really clear example is the fact that Manchin is trying to push through a side deal associated with the Inflation Reduction Act as part of him getting what he wants. And the side deal is a really clear thing that actually we need to be extremely vigilant on, and we need to be fighting actively, which Manchin wants because it looks at NEPA and looks at how we permit energy infrastructure, and basically he wants to accelerate permitting processes, limit the amount of time that environmental justice communities basically have to react to new infrastructure coming in, and green light explicitly the Mountain Valley pipeline. And that is so much of what we're gaining through the Inflation Reduction Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and the tax credits, for instance, for clean energy, we are going to be losing if we are ramming through fossil fuel projects in the next couple of years, if that side deal passes.
So do we expect that side deal to pass, or what is the status of that side deal?
What is the status of that side deal? Absolutely. So it's because it's a permitting bill, it doesn't fall under reconciliation. So that means that they actually have to get Republicans on board. It has to, get that kind of bigger majority. But what Manchin is trying to do is connect it to basically funding the government, right, through continuing resolution. And that means that if we try to hold that up, it could actually, the government, if we don't pass the continuing resolution, like the government would shut down. So there is currently a movement of people who are saying absolutely do not connect this to the continuing resolution. This side deal cannot pass, and we need to eliminate it. There is a pathway for us to get that done, and I think the progressives and climate activists should be throwing their weight to stop this permitting bill because of the extremely detrimental effects.
Okay, and yeah, that responds to the last question from a Patreon supporter, which is, what are the avenues that realistically remain to stop this pipeline? And I guess I would add to that, if the permitting deal goes through, are there still avenues to stop that pipeline? Do you know?
Well, they are hindered. They are hindered. I mean, one of the main ways that MVP organizers and activists have used is permitting. I think that we are going to see escalated, direct action. I think there are ways to continue to contest it in the courts. So I don't think it's our only way to do it, but it is like one of the most critical ways. And so I think that the best way for us to stop the building of the MVP is to stop this side deal.
Mm-hmm. One defense of the permitting deal that I've seen is that it might also, the bad news is maybe it helps us speed up building pipelines. But the good news, some people argue, is that it could help us speed up, building renewable energy and transmission lines as well. Is there anything to this, or?
My answer is no. So I would say, so from my perspective, this is a fossil fuel giveaway. It is very directed at the fossil fuel industry, and renewable energy. I would say it's a false choice in some ways. Like, I do believe that we need to think about how we are rolling out our renewable energy, but the answer is not to streamline. The answer is not to roll over environmental justice communities that may are reckoning with this infrastructure coming in. We actually need to be investing more money in NEPA and building robust processes so that we can get these things passed. One thing I'll bring up is in Denmark, they have been able to successfully build out a massive amount of offshore wind. And in order to bring folks on board, what they did is they offered partial ownership of the offshore wind infrastructure to communities that were going to be directly, will be able to see it. It's in their jurisdiction. And that actually created and cultivated a relationship to that renewable infrastructure, that it was theirs. It was something that they were proud of. And then they also attached to that design. And so they were consulted on the design of the offshore wind. So if you are in Denmark, it's like aesthetically pleasing offshore wind. And that actually helped them build with local communities. They are going to see the benefit of the infrastructure, and they had a say in what it looked like. And in my mind, that is a far more robust process to go through. It's far more consultative and shares the benefit of the renewable energy in comparison to the alternative that's being proposed here, which is let's jam this down people's throats. Let's go move as quickly as possible, and in the process potentially hurt communities or the environment. So I guess I am of the mind that, yeah, sure, we can think about how we handle renewable energy infrastructure and how we deploy it as quickly as possible. But let's not make the same mistakes that we have in the past. Let's make sure that what we build is something that's going to be for everyone, not just for a select few companies. And I think that we need far more planning when it comes to renewable energy anyway, because it's going to take the land mass associated with building out renewables is far more than fossil fuel infrastructure. And we need to be able to make decisions about, what are we allocating to agriculture? What are we allocating to wild land? What are we allocating to, utility scale solar?
Mm-hmm. There was a good article in the LA Times recently that was about that very question of actually bringing in solar and wind and all the land it's going to take. And someone quoted in it used the phrase "go slow to go fast."
Exactly.
Basically, that when you consult people, make people democratically involved in the process, maybe it takes a longer from the start, but then they're more invested in it, and you don't have people starting to oppose it and voting against you or whatever. So yeah, I tend to agree that fast tracking environmental regulations they exist for a reason. So yeah, let's talk about the models associated with this bill. So the kind of overwhelming argument for it, when there's all these pros and cons, is that the claim is that it's going to help us reduce emissions by 40% by 2030 compared to, I believe, 2005 levels. And it's important to keep in mind that this isn't, it's not all that 40% is not all due to the Inflation Reduction Act. Existing policies and technological trends are already predicted to do a good chunk of that reduction. But a good chunk of that 40% would be due to the Inflation Reduction Act. How and I guess those models also show that the leases are not like the oil leases, oil and gas lease, offshore drilling leases you mentioned are not actually expected anyway in the models to cause that much more emissions. How, I guess, part of me, I guess my first instinct is just to like accept this and say, well, it looks like it's a worthwhile trade-off, or I don't know if I would go that far, but it looks like overall it's going to be positive. Part of me then starts to wonder how reliable are models projecting 10 years out in the future, when there's all these other factors going on. So how do you think about the results of models like this?
Yeah. As you mentioned, models are not truths. They are subjective. They're things that we use, and like the inputs and our assumptions matter a lot in building a model. And I think they're very useful tools. They let us think about, how and make try to make decisions, informed decisions about how we are going to decarbonize our country and the world. But I think it is important to remember that assumptions matter. What we've seen is, and also that they're not, set in stone. With some of the models, as you mentioned, like, yes, it says 40% reduction, but what is that in comparison to what was already kind of anticipated? Some of the models are showing that like really this would be about a 7% additional decarbonization from where we currently are, set for in terms of trajectory of current, as you said, technological change and existing policies. The second piece for me with some of these models from discussions with other academics, people who are in this realm, is that we are not considering exports and like what a permitting deal like this would do, in addition to what's extracted on those public lands being shipped abroad. The United States is now, I think, if not number one of the biggest exporters of fossil fuels in the world, of oil and gas. So we have a major carbon leakage problem. So even if we say a lot of these models, and I believe the ones, Rhodium and the models that are looking at the Inflation Reduction Act are considering domestic carbon emissions, but are not considering the outflows, the oil and gas that's going out on those tankers, out to Europe, out to Asia. And that is where we are going to see, like, that is a huge amount of fossil fuel production, and is going to continue us on potential, like, increasing of warming, if we don't also consider the supply of fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. So this bill has been controversial, to say the least, among environmental groups. Some of the larger ones are taking the stance that no, it's not perfect, but still worth supporting, even for some celebrating. And then some of the other, grassroots climate justice groups came out, actively opposed, asking people to vote against it.
Yeah.
So why this disparate response, and how can we kind of think through this?
So on one side, it's a lot of the green groups that are like, you know what? Carbon reduction is carbon reduction. Like, let's go. But I think the thing that from the environmental justice community's perspective is that they got screwed in this deal. They did, is the answer. They did. As we've talked about already, Dayton, like, this is not something that will this does not support public housing. It's not really supporting tenants. It's been lauded by many groups, like green groups, as well as members of Congress, that there's $60 billion going to environmental justice communities. But that's only like about 16% of this total bill. And we think about the commitments that Biden has made to Justice 40 and a lot of the rhetoric around, 40% of benefits should be going to environmental justice communities. Like, that's just so far below where we need to be. And then to add insult to injury, we have the continued development of fossil fuels that are going to be affected. Like, who that hurts and who that kills is environmental justice communities. It is people on the front lines. This also is a backroom deal, right? Like, there is not a lot of, like, small d democracy involved in this bill. We had been negotiating for now, 1.5 years, and the final bill was made between Manchin and Schumer, and we were kind of, like, told to just accept what we got after the, like, constant whittling down. And I think, like, to be clear, not to be clear, I guess, that's not the right word to use. This is like this bill provides inner turmoil for me as well. I think that, as we say very clearly in our report, this is the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think we will see some amount of carbon reduction from this bill. We will see investment, but, like, we have to keep on fighting against some of the, like, build out of infrastructure. We haven't yet talked about in this bill, but, like, a huge amount going to carbon dioxide removal and carbon capture and storage. And I think that from a movement perspective and the development of our movement moving forward, we have a lot of, like, the climate movement has been really working at, like, developing a justice lens. I feel like Sierra Club, a lot of these groups are, making the commitment and trying to like integrate that lens. But this kind of, like, at the moment that the deal is being signed, environmental justice communities are like, well, what the hell? Like, y'all said that you were going to fight for us, but we're the ones on the cutting room floor. So I think that as we move forward, there's a rift in the climate movement right now that I think will have ramifications for years to come in terms of what we're able to accomplish, and it'll be really interesting to see what coalitions emerge from this, and how folks are picking up the pieces. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's look forward. I think that, we've mentioned some things that are ugly in this bill. Some of it is the, mandates for continued oil and gas leasing. Some of it is that as much as there are incentives for clean things, there are also incentives for, continued fossil fuel use and, through carbon capture and storage, which I think if we got the technology down, I would support using it, but I
Totally.
also would not support like counting on it. Because when you count on it, you're saying, yeah, it's going to be okay to keep using fossil fuels because we're going to figure out how to, store all the carbon and it's going to stop emitting so much.
Totally.
Um,
And
and
on that point,
Mhm.
I'll just mention I think that we do at this point in our at this point I really appreciated Holly Jean Buck's work on this and Olufemi Taiwo's work, saying that like, okay, we do actually have to think about what the climate left's reaction is to carbon dioxide removal, how we actually consider like achieving 1.5 degrees and who's in charge of that. The problem that I have right now with how CCS is and CDR is coming down is the fact that the current subsidies as they're landing are almost all used for enhanced oil recovery, which means that they are capturing carbon and then re-injecting it into the ground to acquire more oil, instead of actually going towards like the removal and like lowering of our carbon. So I think it's actually like a really important point for us to keep on interrogating how the left reacts to carbon dioxide removal and what our plan is as it becomes more necessary. But yes, as you say, it isn't technologically where it needs to be so feasible, and it's being like co-opted by the fossil fuel industry.
Mhm. So these are things that are in the bill that's already passed by
Yep.
both houses of Congress. So we aren't going to change the bill. What can be done moving forward to mitigate the worst impacts of it, either from a policy lens or just a movement organizing lens?
Yeah. I think that there are ways both to mitigate the bad and also to increase the good.
Mhm.
And I think this is where state level organizing, local organizing is going to matter a huge amount. There's a lot of money coming down now. And some of that is going to land with state treasuries. It's going to land in state programming, and I think that there are opportunities for folks to take this funding and try to direct it as best as possible towards environmental justice communities. So for instance, one actually quite exciting thing is this greenhouse gas reduction fund. And the greenhouse gas reduction fund is $27 billion that is supposed to go more explicitly towards environmental justice communities and to lower greenhouse gases. But it's very under prescribed right now. And I think that's actually a really important point of contention. And a lot of this money is going to be going down to state-based agencies or quasi-public entities that are local green banks. And so I think it's up to us in the movement to say how we're going to use this thing. Are we going to use it for good? Or is it going to kind of fall by the wayside and, keep on perpetuating neoliberalism? So I would say that, like, absolutely, let's try to take the power of that and use it to invest in affordable housing efficiency. Use it to invest in, distributed renewable energy that will help communities amidst storms, like, Hurricane Uri or the winter storm in Texas, for instance. So I think that is a really important point of contention. Greenhouse gas reduction fund. Any of the funding that's coming down towards the state level will be a really important place for communities to fight for their portion and like what they deserve. And I also think I have spent a lot of my time and research on public ownership campaigns. Trying to take over from investor-owned utilities and invest in, a publicly owned, democratically governed renewable energy utility system. And direct pay, I think, actually opens up space for those campaigns to say, actually, like, this is incredible, like, this will lower the cost even more for us to have our energy system be publicly owned. So I do think there is space in this bill, and especially since it's now passed, for us to contend for power to try to direct this money as best as possible. And also, we're probably going to have to, continue to have direct action camps that are blocking the pipelines that will get built, or the new fossil fuel infrastructure that's coming down.
Mm-hmm. And what does that mean for, like, you've come up with other plans related to, Green New Deal for public schools or transportation, mm-hmm. You mentioned. What is the kind of the policy approach moving forward? How much, hope for further federal action is there? How much will be focused on states and local governments? Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. So if I'm thinking about what happens next, I think that right before Manchin and Schumer got the deal on the table, Biden was within inches of calling for a climate emergency. And I think we have to push the administration, especially now that this funding is also coming through their administration's, departments of energy, housing departments. We need to push them and say, okay, that's great, but that does not get you off the hook, Biden. Like, actually, this is the moment that you have to follow up and declare a climate emergency, leverage your power from an executive action perspective, and also use that power to stop some of this fossil fuel infrastructure stuff. He actually has a huge amount of power to do that. And the People versus Fossil Fuels campaign has been very effective at showing what Biden could be doing and putting the pressure on.
What would a climate emergency mean?
Yeah, so a climate emergency would open up a bunch of additional avenues for him to work, to move and use his executive authority. And it would unleash, his ability to, like, reappropriate funds towards certain things. Another example is there's the Stafford Act, which would allow him to invest more in the case of emergencies. So it would invest in FEMA. They could use that for, renewable energy to go there. He's already utilized, and this doesn't have to require a climate emergency, but he's already started to use his executive powers for things like the Defense Production Act to invest and subsidize and kind of catalyze production of renewable energy goods. So there's a range of different things, and the Center for Biological Diversity has done a huge amount of research showing how they could direct the administration within a climate emergency to leverage more climate action.
Mm-hmm. And then, sorry, you were going on about.
Oh yes, that's right. The other things. Yes, Biden should be pressured to use his executive authority. We should also be ratcheting up ambition at the state and local level. I think there are really incredible campaigns that are out there right now and programs that folks are building. I think one really impressive example is in Pennsylvania. And Senator Nikhil Saval has been able to develop the Whole Homes Repair Act, which would actually be a one-stop shop for people in Pennsylvania to make their houses more efficient. And I could imagine with this funding coming through that they could actually kind of capture some of that funding and helping people to actually access it as well. So I think preparing and ensuring that the funding comes down in a really powerful way will be really important in this next era. And at the congressional level, we have the midterms coming up. It's not looking great for the Democratic Party, but we still do have a growing progressive wing. We have Greg Casar coming in from Texas. We have Summer Lee coming in from Pennsylvania. Like, the squad is growing. And while we may lose power on the short term, I think it's incredibly important for us to continue to build up the capacity of the progressive left in Congress so that once we have power again, we are prepared and ready for a more liberatory sense of how we introduce the Green New Deal, so that we can go further than what we got in the Inflation Reduction Act, and get far closer to the Green New Deal, because I don't think we can give up on Congress completely, but we need to be preparing the state level for additional capacity and funds on climate, be pushing at the state level for green industrial policy and state level Green New Deals, while bolstering and building political power, and like the coalition space for Congress to move, hopefully on the longer term.
Yeah, it feels to me like, as much as we would have liked to get so much more now, and as much as it feels like, this can't wait 2 years. The only thing worse than waiting 2 years is waiting 3 years.
Totally.
So to be prepared to pass stuff that's even better next time feels important.
Totally.
So I just want to ask kind of a couple grab bag questions with our last few minutes, that we haven't touched on yet. The first is about like mining and mineral resources. So you did mention, I believe, that the subsidies for electric vehicles are trying to require supply chains that are, I guess, minerals coming as much from the United States as possible.
Yep.
What are the pros and cons of this?
Yeah.
And what kind of moving forward can be done better in the mining world?
Totally. Well, Climate Community Project member Thea Riofrancos has been really just on top of this, doing incredible research. Again, helped us on that section of our report on the Inflation Reduction Act, and we have kind of increasing work on mining in the next, what's extraction look like in the next horizon of climate action, and from like the good perspective, like there is a lot of the bill focuses on onshoring lithium and battery development, and right now a lot of that is concentrated. A huge amount of like PV is coming from I think it's 95% of like PV components are made from in China. So having more geographic diversity, regionalizing supply chains can be very useful just in terms of disruption. One of the problems, though, is that in the United States, we have archaic mining laws. They are not meant to care for the people who live around the mining. So right now, the mining law on the books is it's called the 1872 mining law, and it really has not been updated since then, which means that it's not really considering environmental protection as much as it should, community protection. And there are examples like the people of Red Mountain who are at these places of extraction that are trying to fight back against that. So I think that in order for us to be doing some of this onshoring, we have to be very clear that like we need to be changing those laws ensuring that we have like best practices for extraction and that we aren't ensuring the same sorts of exploitation that we've seen in the past. One of the things from just like a supply chain management perspective is right now the critical minerals and like the tax credits as they're sorted will be hard to reach. Like right now, electric vehicles that are on market like basically don't qualify for the tax credit because they don't have the number of like required component parts from the United States or so that kind of poses a logistical problem for us as we continue, like as we're building out these batteries. But I think the bottom line for me is how do we ensure the most like justice oriented approach towards battery development, and how do we limit the amount of batteries that we're bringing on market, and think about how we're using our limited resources and how we limit harm of mining by also limiting the number of batteries. And I think that's one of the things that this Inflation Reduction Act's focus on electric vehicles misses out on, because investing in public transportation also would have the opportunity for us to lower the amount of batteries we need to use, because we don't have to have one battery per car. Instead, you have one maybe slightly bigger battery for a bus, but you have 100 people in that bus, not just one person. So I think that there's actually, like, when it comes to managing the transition, some of those things that we need to be talking about and thinking about more. And the Climate Community Project, we're actually working on some materials analysis with some industrial ecologists at UC Davis, along with Thea Riofrancos, to really start charting out what do our transportation pathways mean for U.S., domestic extraction, but also international extraction too. What does this do for Chile, for Mexico, for all these places that we are currently will be new horizons of extraction that Thea has written a lot about as well. Sorry, that was probably a longer jump into that than you were anticipating.
No, that was great. It's definitely an area of interest for me. I had Thea on the show a few months back as well.
Oh, fantastic.
So I guess slowly getting every Climate and Community Project member on Storytelling Animals.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
But yeah, I guess just sort of one last question is just kind of noticing that one thing we haven't talked about is like agriculture and land use policy.
Yeah.
Is there, I've seen mixed things about the bill when it comes to that. So what is there when it comes to ag and land use?
Yeah, so there's not as much as there really should be. We wrote, because we have kind of capacity on staff, our research director, Patrick Bigger, has done a lot in forestry. And overall, there is some funding that's going to kind of public land management, to kind of supporting national park services, because they're like wildly understaffed for considering things like how we handle the increasing number of wildfires, or how we're actually like building in kind of ecological resilience. So that's good, but it's so small, and so it's not really considering how much we should be investing in things like forest management, like land management. They're also, one of the things that we kind of identified as an ugly in that section was there's basically $150 million for this sort of like carbon offset scheme. Okay. And these have, Patrick Bigger has talked a lot about the offset system and how it really does operate as the offsets are quite a false solution that are not actually delivering on climate promises as they should. So I think that's one thing that we saw as lacking, as well as the fact that tribal adaptation. should be far more considered in programs like this, where like tribal communities have so much historic knowledge on managing the lands of the United States and are often kind of cast aside and not supported. So that's something that we really wish was better articulated in the Inflation Reduction Act, and something that we have a piece coming out I think later this week. So keep your eyes peeled for another Climate and Community Project report coming out on forest management and the potential of building good jobs and supporting tribal land management in the process.
Well, cool. I look forward to that. And is there anything else you want to add about any of this?
No, thank you so much, Dayton, for the space to kind of discuss what's in the IRA and how we move forward. I think, like, for me, this is a step. It's an imperfect step, and like the reality is that we just have to keep on fighting for a Green New Deal, and we have to keep on fighting for those to be like justice centered and like actually need to build a like multiracial movement for climate justice. So thank you so much for hosting this podcast and bringing so many people on to talk about our climate futures.
Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah.
That was Johanna Bozuwa of the Climate and Community Project. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much to those Patreon supporters who submitted questions for me to ask Johanna. Thank you so much to all the Patreon supporters who keep this podcast going. And thank you to those climate justice movement advocates who either fought for this and or are fighting for something better. I also wanted to apologize. I had my external microphone plugged in, but for some reason it recorded my audio for the interview on the computer speaker. So if you were missing that patented, crisp Storytelling Animals audio, it'll be back next week. Or next episode, I should say. Next week there is no episode, as we're having book club, but there will be an episode the week after that. Hope to see some of you at our As Long as Grass Grows book club next week. And if you missed that, we're also doing The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler on Thursday, September 29th. More info about that in the episode description. One last clarification I want to make. Feel free to turn off the episode now. But, I asked Johanna about the models, and she mentioned that the difference between business as usual and the Inflation Reduction Act is only a 7% reduction in U.S. emissions. This comes from an estimate from the Rhodium Group. There are other estimates out there. You may have seen one that's up to a 15% difference. I guess I only clarify this in case you've seen a different number out there, you aren't confused. But as we talked about, we won't know for sure how much emissions are reduced until it happens. And as Johanna mentioned, there's other things we can do to keep bending that curve of emissions downward faster and faster. All right. Thanks again for listening, and hope you have a good day.